Welcome to the Play Typer Guide podcast. I'm Stephen Robinson. Joining me today is Meg Reid, the executive director of the Hub City Writers Project in Spartanburg, South Carolina, where she finds and champions new and overlooked voices from the American South. An editor and book designer, Meg's essays have appeared online at outlets such as Diagram, Oxford American, and The Rumpus. Hey, Meg, how are you?
Hi, thanks for having me on.
I'm just excited to have you tell folks listening, watching about Hub City and the work you do, and which I'm very interested in. So I'll just have you run with that if you don't mind.
Sure. So, Hub City Writers Project is a 31-year-old nonprofit organization in Spartanburg, South Carolina. It was founded here in 1995 by three writers who basically wanted to make their city a center for literary arts. And since you're from here, you know that 1995 wasn't the brightest point in Spartanburg's history. This was, Spartanburg is a textile city, and it was kind of its peak post-industrial moment. But they really were inspired by folks like who worked with the Federal Writers Project, which is where we get our name, to look to teachers, writers, librarians, in order to create sort of an oral history record and also celebrate the city. And so that's where we got our start. They published their first book in 1996, and it was only about Spartanburg. It was a local book project, essentially. And out of that came Hub City Press, which is I'm now the publisher of. And Hub City Press is now the only publisher, in the world dedicated entirely to publishing new and extraordinary Southern voices. We're the only publisher dedicated to publishing only work from the South. So from that little local writers project, basically over the 30-year history, we grew to be a nationally and internationally recognized publisher of fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and books of regional interest that still maintains a really, really tight mission statement of just publishing work from the South. And I think the other thing that makes us very different is we everything we do has a community bent. It comes from kind of a community access place, which obviously was different when it was founded 30 years ago, but it's even more different now as publishing has consolidated and conglomerated, and we're down to just, 4 or 5 major corporate publishers. So Hub City is very nonprofit, very mission oriented, and we've had a ton of success just really staying in our lane and publishing the people that we know and the writers basically still in our community, though that community has now grown to be basically Maryland to Texas. So that's where we're at right now, and that's where we came from. So I've been at Hub City since 2013, and I've seen a ton of change, which I can talk about. But it's a pretty cool thing, and it's kind of an interesting model as media, kind of, I don't want to use the word disintegrates, but as media does whatever it's doing right now, it's an interesting model to look from, starting really from inside your community and starting small and growing that way.
And overlooked can often be sort of interpreted specifically as only sort of ethnic, sexual, gender minorities, but that's not always the case. Overlooked can be people of all sort of backgrounds whose stories aren't necessarily told from the South. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. We really do try to paint, with our catalog, we try to paint the clearest picture of sort of the modern, contemporary, and historic South. And that is a much richer and more diverse place than people realize. And that isn't just black and white. That isn't just black, brown, and white. That is, also like, queer Southerners, and which are, I think the South is actually the queerest region per capita in the whole country. These are things that people don't often associate when they paint the South with a really broad brush of just sort of being white and rural. But I will say we also do have to your point of it not being one particular ethnicity or sort of group, we also have a real penchant for publishing sort of interesting work from rural America and from the rural South, because honestly, that is just as overlooked and just as ignored often as other groups. And so what we see is that corporate publishing, larger press publishing tends to be looking for one kind of story from the South. Whether that's Civil War stuff or magnolias and sweet tea and all of that kind of stuff, like very beachy stuff. And that tends to be where all Southern, especially fiction, kind of goes into those little pots. And so our mission is really just finding anything that is, exciting and different. Like for an example, I always give, we published a novel called The Prettiest Star by Carter Sickles. And it was a story, he had trouble selling it to a New York publisher. And based on the fact that it was a story about a man who moves from New York City back to rural Ohio, Kentucky border. And he has AIDS, and he basically is kind of coming into contact with his whole family before he dies. And the response that we had heard, or he had heard, was that AIDS was more of a urban story. It wasn't a rural story, which is sort of ignoring the fact that the AIDS crisis was something that was nationwide and it affected communities, large, small, rural, urban. So that's what we're most excited by, is when we can find, whether it's a fiction, nonfiction, it doesn't matter, but like something that points to a story that's truer about the South and that often goes untold or overlooked.
Yeah, and I know even when I was young, growing up in the South, there was a lot of diversity of even amongst, say, white Southern writers. So I really liked Flannery O'Connor, and then William Faulkner, Tennessee Williams, drastically different, despite essentially being white Southerners, would be sort of wrong to sort of paint them all by that same brush.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, North Carolina has a really rich, intense literary history that is kind of circled around Algonquin books of Chapel Hill, but that is very distinct from Mississippi or Louisiana. It's the South is so large and it is so diverse that and they're all different from Wendell Berry or something in Kentucky. So the idea that there's one type of Southern writer talking about one thing is it doesn't make sense to me. It never has, and so that's what our catalog is, sort of kind of an intentional corrective. That's what we're always kind of, that's the larger project we're always at work with.
And so speaking of the South, is sort of, especially in Greenville, South Carolina, because a lot of the Southern literature I enjoy talks about sort of was written in a time of sort of addressing sort of what's called the New South, or the South post something as impactful as the Civil War for that region, of like, and how people related and coped. But I would say Greenville specifically has changed tremendously since I left. I graduated from college in '96, and I lived there. But I was working for the Greenville News, the local paper there, during the summers. So I was seeing the drastic changes in downtown, or whatever. But a lot of that had happened after I had left, to the point that there is sort of a similar sense of almost a New South when you talk about Greenville. Someone had posted on social media video footage of downtown from when I was there, and I was like, "Oh my God, am I really that old?" It looks like
Black
something
and white.
Exactly. It's like just the downtown area, and it would be suddenly very familiar. It's like, oh right, this has really changed. And that just leads me to the question of sort of, for you, someone who came, you did you come to the South in 2013, or did you just join Hub City? I'm just sort of interested always in sort of that journey of people to the area.
I moved from North Carolina, and I moved to North Carolina in 2009. So I've actually lived, I was born in Canada and I grew up in Maine, but I've now lived in the South for the longest period of anywhere I've ever lived. So, that kind of sneaks up on you, to your point. Like suddenly you're like, oh, I just got here, essentially. And then you look up and it's 17 years later, and you say, oh, I think this place might be like a pretty big part of my identity by this point. But to your point, I do think, there's been so much kind of ink spilled on the New South and that idea of the New South. And I don't think there's been enough consideration to what we are in now. I find that the disconnect between what people's impressions are of the South, or these sort of assumptions and biases that people have towards the South as a sort of monolith, and then the move to rates, when you look at the top metros, like fastest growing metros. I mean, like, I think Greenville, Spartanburg, 30 people move, every day or something like that. Like
Mhm.
it's bonkers. Raleigh, rapidly expanding. Charleston, rapidly expanding. And that of course is not happening like universally across the South, like Mississippi or the deeply rural parts. But I do think that yeah, there's a feeling that sometimes things get a little bit frozen in amber, and you have to say like the South of 2026 is not the South of 1996 or the South of 1966. Like these are massive changes, and it is election day today, and it is worth thinking about all of these people moving to the South, and it's changing it, in many ways, most ways for the better, some ways, not for the better with
Mhm.
infrastructure and energy use and all these like scary things. But I do think that sometimes when we put out books that are set in contemporary South, I still think we get a little bit of like kind of a like, because people think that everybody here is in, like straw hats and barefoot or something. Like, I think even if people they're not fully aware that they're bringing that to it, that's what they're bringing forward into any conversation that our books enter.
Yes, I mean, sort of that culture shock. I mean, even when I moved out in Portland, you would find, for me, it's not sort of often regional differences. It's often more city versus rural. And if I'm in rural Oregon, it would sometimes be very familiar to me,
Mhm.
having grown up in the rural South or whatever. And I could be with someone who had only been in Portland, the city of Portland or the suburbs, and when they would have more shock just an hour outside of that than I did, culture, because like, oh yeah, this seems very familiar. So I
Familiar.
think that's I would be curious in your sort of, I guess, the extent of the culture shock for you coming from having Canada, Maine. It's very obviously different
Mhm.
environments. Aside from getting used to the heat, I'd imagine. I don't want to presume a lot, but being from those areas,
Yeah.
coming in to the heat, and um, I'm a redhead of sorts. I don't know if
Yep.
it's what was that experience like?
Yeah, and I mean, I think to your point, the coming from Maine, which I lived in a small college town for the years before I moved to North Carolina, and so like I was deeply steeped in rural culture, and so to me, moving to like the areas around Spartanburg and Greenville,
Hmm.
the very deeply rural pockets, they feel very at
Hmm.
home. It's incredible how
Absolutely.
much totally different like foliage, totally different trees, totally different accents, and yet there's something that just permeates that feels. If you are from a rural place, I think you carry that with you, regardless, and it adapts wherever you go. Um, but I think that I think I came to this a little bit free of I don't know, like some self bias stuff. Like I came in and my POV was always, why can't we do what other presses are doing? Why can't we do what the presses in Minneapolis are doing or the presses in California? Why do we come from like a scarcity model? Like, why are we not thinking about all that we have, and why are we not more proud of how rich the literary culture and writing culture is in the South, and the storytelling culture? I mean, just like at large. Um, so yeah, beyond the heat, which I took to, and everyone always says every time it gets cold, I get so mad, and everybody says, "Well, you're from Canada." And I say, I'm not there anymore. Obviously, like I made a decision. Um, but yeah, I feel like I have I never had a lot of culture shock because I think I was used to small town and semi-rural kind of environments. I find the South's particular, intricacies and sort of, oddities and everything very interesting, and it makes extremely good literature. You read the stuff and you see, then you come to the South and you're like, oh my God, like these people are great writers, but also this is such an intensely funny, weird place. And so I think I have always found it just an incredibly rich place.
Um, and Greenville and Spartanburg have changed tremendously, and it's almost, I mean, if you didn't have much experience prior to that, I mean, living there now, it is such a I would dare say cosmopolitan area at, what you have access to and everything. And it's um just it's fascinating, but yet I think it's still maintained a sort of essential southern and southern charm. It still feels, whenever I've gone back, it still feels like home, even if it's like been developing constantly. So I'm always impressed by that. I'm impressed by the people covering it to a degree, like writing about what it's like to live in a place that's changed so much. Even to the extent that I was sort of on the ground, a little bit of it. I remember one of my first when I was interning at the Greenville News, the big story breaking about the BMW coming,
Mhm.
and that became, I wouldn't realize it in my late teens at the time, but I didn't realize how significant that would
Right.
be for a community, and how, altering that was, or like these choices that would be made that would now um, result in a sort of a very different city.
Yeah, and it's really altered the landscape. Because it's not just, I always tell people it's not just BMW too. It's all these associated. To me they're like widgets. I don't know what they make, but I know they make things to support BMW.
Yeah,
Most of which are foreign companies. And both Greenville and Spartanburg have just benefited so greatly from this sort of weirdly, like you said, cosmopolitan European, and now some Japanese as well, like manufacturing coming in, and it has obviously changed the landscape quite a bit. I don't even know if anybody could have predicted what it was going to kick off, for this part of the world. I do think that we retain a certain southernness, though. I mean, like, I think especially Spartanburg, because it's smaller obviously than Greenville, but Greenville as well. I had a friend in town a couple weeks ago, and we were just walking around Spartanburg and getting a glass of wine and stuff, and she said, everybody keeps talking to us. And I said, you're in the South. And she said, no, I just got to be something on my face or something today. And I said, no, you're in the South. You know what I mean? No matter how many multinational companies we have and how many people from California and, New York and wherever else move in, there's still something fundamental about, that, like, kind of to me, being northern, kind of like strange openness that southerners have to kind of just start a conversation with you, in the grocery store or whatever. And that's probably the major thing I had to learn, because in the Northeast, especially like in Boston and Maine, that kind of really kind of cold Northeast, everybody is trying to like preserve their heat source, I think. And there wasn't a whole lot of talking in public. And when I first moved to Wilmington and then to here, I was constantly surprised by people. And now I yap
yeah.
at people in the grocery store all the time. It's great. It's very freeing. People need to try it out everywhere else.
Well, it's not surprising, right? Like if you go in Europe, like French culture is very different from Italian culture and and if you look at the size of the United States, it's sort of similar. Like, why wouldn't
Yeah,
this region
exactly.
be culturally different from the other region? I mean,
Scandinavia versus Italy or something like that. Yeah,
yeah.
it's a huge geographic area.
Um, so I know you're a fan of literary nonfiction, and
Mhm.
I know that that's an interest of mine as well. I've loved, but often the stuff that's from the South. I loved Midnight, The Garden of Good and Evil, other stories
Yes.
like, and that's also, I mean, as a journalist, I love the idea of like reporting on something that has happened, sort of extensive feature writing,
Hmm.
but there's
My
so much.
favorite.
Yeah, yeah, but there's so much of the history, and to me as a South, it's sort of the term Southern Gothic is often used, but there's such a rich history in the South. I think often, um, my wife and I love doing ghost tours whenever we
Yes.
travel, and those haunted history tours tend to have the most depth in the South. There's such a um, both the folklore, often obviously roots and enslavement and whatever, can be sort of like underneath the superficial. There's something potentially sinister and whatever, and um, I've found that fascinating, and I think that that's something that's rich about Southern storytelling.
It really is. And it's so surface level in the low country and in Georgia, Sea Island, Georgia, and that part of the region. And I think about it, in terms of the history with slavery and just the mass amount of people who came to this country through slavery in Charleston, particularly, but also down that coastline. And there's just absolutely no reason that it would not feel as like completely, absolutely haunted as it is. But I do think the thing that I find so fascinating is that I think the whole culture is very in touch with ancestors. You know what I mean? Like I
Mm.
think that it's rubbed off on whether people are willing to own up to this, but I think it's rubbed off on the culture at large too. Is this really kind of deeply held feeling of ancestors being close by, and you don't feel that when you go in other parts of the South necessarily, but that coastal New Orleans, Savannah, Charleston, anywhere where those slave ports were, it's just such a rich and fascinating and disturbing history that feels like it's so close at hand. And it's like, yeah, you really get the gothic thing. You're like, oh, this is very gothic. This isn't reaching for gothic. Like it's right there at the surface level.
Oh
And
yeah, the depth and the folklore. My wife and I were in Paris some time ago, and we went on a history tour. And I think the guide was like, "Yes, often in the French are sort of like, we don't believe in phantoms. Like they have no, they just don't have that sort of. We don't have.
right,
This is an old building. Like, but
right.
surely someone died there, right? Like, was there? Did anyone
Gotta be
see
some
anything?
creepy stuff.
There's
Yeah.
something creepy, but they're very kind of like, no, it was built a long time ago, and here's some people who owned it, and there'd be compelling stories, but like there's that kind of root of mystery that's often that I find in the South are some of the best. I think that richness of the history.
100%. And yeah, I think maybe we got all the people who were more willing to believe or something. You know what I mean? Those are the people that flung themselves across the ocean and then mixing up with all the other populations and everything. Yeah, because I feel like if you're in Charleston or you're in Savannah, even not from just like a marketing and like branding perspective, you go to places and they're just like, oh yeah, well this is haunted. This person died there, and like this is, and you're just like, I'm just trying to eat dinner. Like you're telling me, who died in this room and stuff like that. Or if you have an apartment, well, I lived in Wilmington, which is also a port town, and every apartment we had, they were like, okay, well here's who died in here, and you're like, can I just pay you rent and not have to take
Yeah, I
on
don't
these ghosts?
take on the ghosts and the mysteries.
Exactly.
Um, so obviously the world of publishing is as it gets more complicated, I guess is the euphemism to use as time goes by, and what's how is that impacting you? Like, do you still see is readership? Where's readership now?
Where is readership now? I would say book sales are flat-ish, down-ish. Everybody is very upset about nonfiction. Other people will, because nonfiction sales appear to be slipping like the most out of anything, but other people will say that what we're experiencing is like a very long-term adjustment from the pandemic. The pandemic, as awful as it was, it's a reading high point. I don't know if we will ever globally and culturally reach the level of reading that we had going on in the pandemic. How it's like everybody reads on airplanes, and you're like, you're in
Mhm.
the airport, and you're like, why does everybody have a book? Because like they don't have a book but they know they're going to be in this space, and they bring a book. I think that's kind of like in the pandemic, it was like that, but just for 2 years, and so people read really heavily, and the fiction adjustment came really, really quickly after, like in 21, 22, it really fell off and kind of went back to where it had been. Nonfiction stayed really strong. And so I think an argument could be made that we're just seeing an adjustment from back to pre-pandemic levels. It's just taken a little while. But overall, there's just so much competition for attention and for my complaint as somebody who loves this, like what you're talking about, like literary journalism, my absolute favorite stuff, the stuff where people are allowed to go out and just kind of dig around and follow their instinct and their gut and write something and see what develops. There's very few places that run that kind of thing. And I think a lot of outlets, like media outlets, want you to make a video, want you to make a podcast, they want a book to be a podcast, to be a video, to be a TV series. You know what I mean? There's a sense of like IP sort of taking over. And so
Mhm.
books just can't be books anymore. They're like part of a pipeline of sort of content. So that is all very worrying. And it's not great. There are some upsides. We're getting better and better books right now because the bigger publishers are they're just being a little wary because they obviously have seen some books underperform in the last couple of years, and so they're just pumping the brakes a little bit, which means we're getting better and better stuff from agents. And so that's like a wonderful. We've really had some excellent books in the last year. But also, the other exciting thing for us is I have it behind me here, but Writs of the Bayou by Nancy Lemon. That's a reissue of a piece of literary journalism about she went down to cover the trial of Edwin Edwards, who was the sitting governor of Louisiana and was on trial for racketeering. This is in the 80s. And she was covering it for Vanity Fair, and she did a terrible job being a court reporter. She didn't report any of the facts. She just talked about Louisiana families and New Orleans people and observed everything. And so it ended up coming out from Knopf and then going out of print. And I had been hearing for years that needed to come back in because it was just this singular book. And we ended up publishing that this spring. And there was real room for it. There was real, excitement about it. And so I do think that, to your point about kind of everything is shifting right now. And I do think for literary publishers, for creative publishers, for publishers who are not trying to like chase content and repeat, low risk projects like just in infinitum. Like, I think there's a real opportunity to do new and different things, and that might be reissuing things. That might be shorter books. People are kind of moving back towards shorter books. So there's lots of exciting things happening. It does feel like a real kind of, a point where we're kind of all pausing to see what's going to happen next. I didn't mention the literacy rates because I know how bad they are, but also, we run a bookstore here in Spartanburg, and it's busier than it's ever been with younger
No,
people.
great.
So I feel less doom about that. I think if you work in a bookstore for any length of time, you're like just excited by everybody coming in, and it makes you a little bit more hopeful. But I do kind of wonder, the polling problem where it's like polls are off because they're not calling the right people. I do wonder about some of these literacy stats if younger people are not getting picked up in certain ways because they're engaging, they're either listening to things or they're reading on Wattpad or they're reading on, different places than the traditional books can be tracked. So I'm trying not to feel too depressed about that because I see how many young people are in my store buying books, and that is the most like hopeful thing. People are still buying books. People still love books. I just think it's an overgrown industry. The whole book industry is just huge. There's too many books coming out, and there's going to have to be some sort of a adjustment at some point. Which, if you're a small publisher, like we do 8 to 10 books a year, we're already that we're in our lane. We're publishing how many we need to publish, so it doesn't affect us as much. But I wonder about the larger culture if we'll see a dialing back because there's just too many books coming out and not enough
Oh
attention
yeah.
being given to each of them.
I know I was someone who loved books, and I loved books so much. I was one of the quickest to go digital. People were surprised by that because it's
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, but you have books, you guys, such a library at home. It's like, well, yes, for that reason. I love to be able, I no longer have to travel around the New York subway with a bunch of books in my
Right.
backpack
Heavy
or
books.
whatever. But I always, the ones that I would be consult when writing, I always had like Breakfast at Tiffany's and Great Gatsby and whatever. It's like, I can just call up anything, or if someone mentions a book, I can just download it immediately. It's wonderful. But, you know, to get folks like me, I always wonder if like, is there selling the presentation of books? So bookstores having community, you come in and it's when people do signings that people have tried to find a way to grab people to because the immediacy has changed. Same with like with
Yeah.
records and so forth. Like, well, I can
Actually,
get this instantly.
record stores are a huge inspiration. And we have Independent Bookstore Day because of Independent Record Store Day, which I used to work at a record store when Independent Record Stores Day started, which was like in the early 2000s. And it's been a huge success and driving people back to that, like, hey, like giving them, like you said, this sense of urgency, like you have to go on this day or you're not going to get it. And I do think that bookstores are doing some of that with like release party nights and things like that, but also in a small market like Spartanburg is considered, a smaller market. Even Greenville would be a smaller market. Like, and you're not really large cities. Most independent bookstores are saying that they need to have sort of a mix of author and non-author content. And I think I was just talking about this on sort of a Substack post, and I think a lot of authors were like immediately pearl clutching. They were like, no, no, that sounds terrible. And, I gave the example that we did a collaboration with the coffee shop that we have in our building where it was like a Gilmore Girls Day last fall. And we had Rory's picks because there's hundreds of books on that show that are mentioned in Gilmore
Mhm.
Girls. And they made coffee, and people, like girls with their moms, came, like moms and daughters, groups of girls came. And it was the single biggest non-holiday day that we had last year.
Oh,
And there
wow.
was no author, there was no reading, there was no, you know what I mean? And so I do think that to capture people at all different stages and styles of reading, because reading is so much bigger than just books now. Like, it's just hugely more, there's just so many more expansive ways. We have to have a mix in order to stay alive and be relevant. We have to have a mix of book and sort of book adjacent non-author content. And whether that means, silent reading clubs, audiobook walks, sessions where you come in and just listen to audiobooks together in the bookstore, where the kind of consumerism and the author centered approach is you dial that back and you really make it about let's make reading visible again. Let's make it apparent and obvious that people are reading together. And I think that's the new drive a lot behind a lot of bookstores now, is how do we build a larger culture of reading. And it isn't just around going to read, to hear somebody read from a new book and buy that book. You know what I mean? That's one
Mhm.
way, but there are a lot of ways that you can get people. And, it's kind of elitist, I think, to assume that that's the best and only way. I think you have to have a broader range of offerings. And that's how you're going to get the widest range of people in.
Yeah, well, doing more things that you can't ignore social media, right? And one of the benefits of social media is that people feel connected. It's like when we were reading a book when I was young, when I was younger, as we discussed a long time ago. But you would often feel like, I guess, because this was published, that there are other people reading this, but I have no
I
idea,
don't
right?
know.
I
Yeah.
don't like. Is anyone else like flipping out over flowers in the attic? Like, does anyone else know about what's in this? Like, no one who knows. And now the internet has created this sort of environment where you can go online and discuss things and talk about things, and you're not sort of alone. And I think you're sort of replicating that, right? Like, you can kind of go and there'll be other people there who can kind of, and book clubs were one of the biggest things for drivers for that, but it's a social thing. It's sort of like, it takes something that feels sort of asocial, you're just reading alone, and makes it a very community driven aspect. And to me, anything that can do that is sort of a positive. I think I've written in the past about illiteracy as opposed to illiteracy, like people well educated, so like doctors, lawyers. It's not just that they can't read; they don't have the
Yes.
time. And when they
100%.
do have the time, it's like, I'm exhausted, I'm just going to watch a home makeover show or some you know the other
Or
Bennett
I'm
sisters.
going to watch something on my TV while also looking at my phone. And,
Yeah.
I always point out that I heard it said a few months ago, and it really made an impression on me, that books are one of the last like true solo experiences you can have where you're in your own head for a like very long period of time. And there's no advertising, there's no algorithm, there's like absolutely nothing else, kind of influencing how you're taking in the information. It's just you and your own consciousness. And I would say I 100% agree with the illiteracy thing, and I think that it's also that after watching like light TV and a second screen, I think people have really fallen out of the practice and the habit of that deeper kind of concentration, and now it does feel like a lot of work. And so any ways that we can but everybody knows that if you find the right book at the right moment, not the book you feel like you're supposed to read, not the one that everybody else is reading, like just the book that you pick up and is so exciting to you, it feels like it flies by, and you just, you know what I mean, you race through it. And so I think that it really is a combination of, like you said, lowering the barriers, getting people in so that they can feel comfortable in these book spaces, and accepted, and then find something that is going to like, alight them and make them remember how much they loved reading maybe when they were younger and had less distractions and less responsibilities. Because yeah, I really do think it is probably not a crisis of illiteracy, it's a crisis of illiteracy. So anything we can do to help, people feel safe to kind of do that deeper concentrating work by themselves or in community is a net positive. And it's why bookstores are really a common good, like a museum or a symphony or anything like that.
And being able to get those spaces, so in a downtown, that feels like this is a good community aspect to have a bookstore often connected to a coffee shop or something. To be a community space is great. And as these downtowns thrive, I'm glad that that's still happening, that they're not being necessarily priced out, that they still exist, because it's still
yeah, it's very hard. It's very hard. I'm part of since we're a nonprofit, our bookstore is a nonprofit, and I'm part of a consortium of nonprofit bookstores. And we have nonprofit bookstores in this consortium that are on native reservations in Oklahoma and also in Palo Alto. And those two places have almost nothing in common, except for neither one can afford the space, essentially based on books, because books are a very low margin product. And for completely different reasons, neither one of them can afford to keep their space. So there are definitely pressures, because it's very difficult, unless you're the Strand or something, to sell enough books to really pay a lot of city rents. But people are doing it, and they're finding creative ways to get people in. And what we always talk about is that this idea of bookstores being a public good is also that cities that have bookstores report happier citizens and more socially engaged and civically minded citizens. So bookstores are, and we've seen, if you came to Spartanburg in 1996, we opened the store in 2010, and it was the only store in downtown. And now we have a baseball stadium and 2 new hotels going in, and you know what I mean. There's been a ton of development. And our bookstore has been sort of at the center of it. And it's like, I'm not taking credit for it, but I know that bookstore made people, even before my time, made people feel safe, that they could come downtown and that there was something, and that it was a really early investor in the community. And now the whole city has just kind of grown up around us. So bookstores are good for cities. That's always my bullet point.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with me about this. And how can people, one, find you, help with your nonprofit, or what are some things that people can do?
Yeah. Personally, I'm on basically Blue Sky and Substack. Those are the two that I sort of use and talk about books and talk about the industry, because of the way that we're a publisher and bookstore, so we kind of see both sides of it. And then in terms of, we are Hub City Writers or Hub City Press on all of the platforms, and we are a nonprofit organization, and that's what I would close by saying. We saw our NEA grant get terminated last year, and there's been a lot of cuts to federal and state funding, arts funding, that kind of thing, especially for like now that there's really urgent needs. So I think people like public radio or the Symphony are beginning to understand that if they want independent publishers, nonprofit publishers to exist, they're going to have to support them. And they can do so by making a tax deductible donation. So hubcity.org/support is where they can do that. And and we're very chatty about publishing online. So I suggest people, follow us and learn about what we're doing and see all the good stuff we're putting out there.
Well, wonderful. Meg Reid, thank you so much for joining us. Like, share, subscribe, and we will catch you next time.